One morning in the spring of 1959, a middle-aged civil engineer named Wu Chiu biked through his rural town in Taiwan. He was on his way home from work, and normally he sort of enjoyed this bike ride home. He would take his time and look at the beautiful temple and all the marketplaces. But today, he was not looking at the scenery. He was in a huge rush because he had gotten word that his wife had become horribly sick. And so Wu is pedaling as fast as he possibly can, trying to get home to his wife to help her and take care of her. But as he got to his neighborhood, he started to realize that he was really gassed. Like literally pedaling to his house was just unbelievably exhausting. Now he was sort of sprinting, but at the same time, Wu was a pretty athletic guy. And so this type of a ride was something that he should have been able to handle. But it just sort of seemed like there was a weight attached to him, like he was pulling an extra 100 pounds or something. But regardless, Wu pushed through the pain, knowing he had to get to his wife at all costs, and he turned the corner onto his street, and as he was making his final approach to his house, he saw one of his neighbors. And even though Wu was completely in a rush, he was also very polite. And so even though he's sweating and hustling, he still took the time to turn and wave to his neighbor. And his neighbor, who clearly looked at Wu, made eye contact with him, saw it was Wu. Instead of waving back, they kind of scowled at Wu, like they were disgusted by him. They didn't wave back and they turned and just went the other way. And Wu's like, what was that about? What did I do? But again, Wu has to get home, so he sort of wrote that off and he's like, okay, keep on pedaling. He gets even closer to his house, and then it just so happens another neighbor comes outside, and again, Wu's politeness comes through, and he's like sweating profusely. He's like, hey, how are you? And this neighbor as well looks at Wu with this look of total disdain on their face, like there's something wrong with Wu. And Wu's like, what did I do? What's going on here? And so that neighbor does not wave back. They go back inside their house. But again, Wu really can't focus on this weirdness with his neighbors. He needs to get home to his wife. And so again, with his heavy legs, he finally gets to his house, parks his bike, and runs inside to see his wife. Wu would find his wife in their bedroom, in bed, and she was looking very pale and sick. Her name was Lin Wang Yao. She was 37 years old, and generally speaking, she was a pretty frail person who was sort of prone to minor illnesses all the time. And so, Wu was sort of accustomed to her not doing so well. But as soon as he saw his wife, he could tell that whatever was going on with her was serious. This was not one of her typical bouts of, minor illnesses. Something was wrong here. And so Wu immediately began to tend to his wife. He made her some soup and some tea, but, Lin barely could sip either of them. And Lin also, she had this fever that just kept getting worse and worse. And, Wu was hoping she would break the fever at some point, but, all night as Wu was up tending to her, her fever just kept getting worse. And so Wu, he really didn't know what to do. And this is 1959, they're in a rural village in Taiwan. And so it was difficult to get to a hospital. And so Wu really wanted to find a way to treat his wife at home. And he was just praying that, over the next 24 hours or so, she would show signs of getting better. But over the next couple of days, Lin did not get better. Her fever never broke. She basically stopped eating and drinking. And it was like she was drifting in and out of consciousness. And then finally, after 3 days of this, Wu knew, if I don't get my wife to a hospital, no matter how hard it is to do that, she might not make it. The primary hurdle for Wu to get Lin to the hospital was actually just transportation. He didn't have a car, but he did know that one of his neighbors on his street had a donkey cart. And so he could maybe load his wife into that, and they could get her to the hospital in the cart. And so Wu, he went outside and he found the neighbor who happened to be outside, actually with their donkey cart, and he flagged them down and he asked them if they'd be willing to transport Lin to the hospital in their cart. But just like a few days earlier, when Wu had been biking on his street and his neighbors had been totally weird to him and sort of looked at him with these obvious looks of disgust, this neighbor, who knew Wu really well, looked at Wu and basically gave him one of those looks, like, you gross person, and he turned around like he wasn't even gonna talk to Wu. But then Wu, in desperation, just says, look, my wife, she's dying. She needs to get to the hospital. Please do it for her. And at that, this neighbor, clearly despite their misgivings, sort of turns back around and says, fine, we can use the cart and get her to the hospital. And so Wu and this neighbor, they go into Wu's house, they scoop up Lin, they put her on the cart, and it takes several hours, but they do eventually get her to the hospital. And by the time they're there, Lin is basically unconscious. They rush her inside, and the doctors and nurses, they try to do everything they can to stabilize Lin. But as soon as she was admitted, it was like her condition only got worse and worse. And that night, she slipped into a coma, and then she died. Wu was devastated. He and the neighbor took Lin's body, put it back on the donkey cart, and brought it back to their town. And then Wu began setting up for a funeral service. So in Taiwan, it's customary during funerals to have the body of the loved one be brought into the house where it stays for 7 days before they're cremated. And so Wu, after getting Lin's body back home, he put her into a coffin, set her up in the living room, and then over the next several days, Wu was at home next to his dead wife as friends and family, and even the neighbors who, clearly had some issue with Wu, they all came in to pay their respects. And while this was happening, Wu, who was already devastated at the loss of his wife, as he would listen to people come in and pray over the body and sort of talk to the body as if she was still alive and talk about how wonderful she was, it really hit Wu hard because it was like he was suddenly realizing how different his life was going to be without his wife. Lin was a very simple woman. She was illiterate, she really didn't travel, and she was very introverted and quiet, but she was a wonderful wife. She took care of Wu, she cared about him deeply, she was a wonderful cook, and just generally, she made people around her feel safe and happy. And so, Wu, it's like he just found himself over and over having these fits of just crying. Like he can't believe that Lin is now gone. But on the third day after Lin had passed away, so now we're about halfway through this funeral service, which takes about a week, Wu was in his living room dealing with this overwhelming sadness about losing his wife, and there's this procession of people coming in and out of the house. And as Wu was sitting there, there was sort of a cadence and a rhythm to how the days were going. But at some point, it was like everybody in the room just suddenly went completely silent, and then people began to gasp. And Wu, he was sort of head down dealing with his sadness, and he sort of noticed the change in the room, and he heard people gasping, and he looked up and he noticed a few of the mourners. They weren't just gasping, they were open-mouthed and horrified, and they were looking at the casket. And so Wu went from the mourners and he looks over at the casket, and there in this open casket is Lin, except now she's sitting upright, looking around the room, clearly alive. Now, at first, Wu's reaction was, oh my goodness, my wife must have just slipped into a really deep coma, so deep that the doctors could not distinguish it from death. And so this is a mistake, like she was never dead. She's just, waking up from her coma. But at the same time, as Wu's having this immediate reaction to seeing his wife sitting up in her coffin, he's thinking, but over these 3 days that I've not left her side, I've been with her body the whole time. She's not moved, she's not made a sound, she's certainly not had anything to eat or drink. Like, this just doesn't seem possible. And so Wu and the other mourners, after the shock of seeing this sort of wore off, everybody kind of jumped into action, and they rushed over to the casket, and they very gently lifted Lin out of the casket, and they carried her over to her bed, and they laid her down, and Lin immediately kind of gestured for water. She was too weak to speak. She had lost a bunch of weight, but she's gesturing for water, and so they give her some water, and she sips the water, and everyone's looking at Wu like, we have to get her to the hospital. Like, what else can we possibly do? But Wu, he's looking at his wife, and she's so frail. She really seems like now she is on the precipice of dying here. And he's thinking, she can't survive another donkey cart ride to the hospital. And so we have to keep her here and hope that she, recovers enough that maybe in a day or two we could bring her to the hospital, but certainly not now. And so over the next couple of hours, Wu, along with some friends and family, just stayed by Lin's bedside, constantly checking on her, making sure she really was alive. And, she was, albeit, very subdued, but she continued to drink water and had a little food. And amazingly, over the span of only a few hours, Lin went from basically literally being dead to actually seeming to get a whole lot better. In fact, to the point where, Lin was actually sitting up in bed and, stretching and moving around as if she was completely fine. In fact, in Wu's opinion, it almost seemed like within a few hours, she was actually physically almost better off than she was normally when she was alive. Like, it was a miracle how quickly she was recovering. And so by that night, when Lin really did seem like she was effectively back to her normal self, the mourners all left and said, okay, well, I guess Lin's okay. And they left, and then it was just Wu and Lin. And Wu had no idea how to handle any of this. He was just so grateful that his wife was alive, even though, again, none of this made any sense. Like, this is so shocking, but he's just grateful that she's alive. The next day, when they woke up, Lin was so much better that she was out of bed, walking around the house, really excited to face the day. And Wu's like, dude, you were dead yesterday. Like, what's going on here? But Lin said to him, hey, I want to go out on a walk. You want to go on a walk with me, go to the temple? And Wu, he's looking at Lin, still like unable to comprehend what's happened here. But he's thinking, she does seem like she's in great health right now, and if she wants to go for a walk, great, I'll go with her. And so the two of them went outside and they began to walk. And as they're walking, Wu, he's a pretty athletic guy, remember? He found himself barely able to keep pace with Lin, who was like speed walking towards the temple. And on top of that, as they're walking and Wu's like, gassed as he's trying to keep up with his wife, periodically neighbors would, wave to Lin and Wu, and for just a brief second they would chat. And as Wu listened to Lin speak, he began to notice something really strange. That Lin, maybe he didn't notice it before, but he was definitely noticing it when she was speaking to other people. She just sounded different, like her accent was different. It did not sound like his wife. And the weirdness around Lin's miraculous recovery only got more weird over time. Before Lin died and came back to life, she had been illiterate. But now, she was not only able to read, but she could also read and speak fluent Mandarin, a language she didn't know before she died. Also, Lin used to be a really skilled cook who loved cooking meat dishes in particular. But now that Lin has recovered, she no longer wanted to eat meat. She said she was a vegetarian and basically stopped cooking. Also, Lin began speaking with real authority about the professions of accounting and bookkeeping. And then also she advised her husband to quit his job as an engineer and open up a building materials shop in town because there was a real need for it and he'd make real money that way. And believe it or not, like Wu, he doesn't understand what's going on with his wife, but she really seemed like a force to be reckoned with now. And however she had gained all this extra knowledge, it really seemed like she was sharp these days. And so he was like, all right. And he quits his job as an engineer, opens up this building materials shop, and really quickly, he and his wife began making real money, more money than they had ever made before. And while all this was happening, Wu and Lin became the biggest curiosity in town. The story of how Lin had miraculously come back to life with all these bizarre personality changes, not only was that spreading all around town, but it eventually spread all across the country. It was like everybody was talking about Lin. In fact, this story spread so far that it eventually reached the Taiwanese government. And when they heard about it, they were so intrigued, they decided they would investigate. And so on March 17th, 1962, the Taiwanese government sent for Lin. And Lin was very happy to go. She was ready to tell her story and answer any questions they had. This was all just kind of exciting, the idea that the government wanted to know how she had made this unbelievable recovery. And so the government, they scoop her up and they bring her to this army hospital and they tell her she's gonna be meeting with the chief physician there. And so the chief physician, he's inside of the room, he's waiting for Lin. He's never met her before. He's only been told roughly what the story is. There's this woman who's acting really funny after coming back from the dead, and okay, fine, I'm gonna talk to her and see what's going on. And so Lin, she walks in the room and the chief physician, he looks at her, she's an ordinary looking woman, and she walks over to him, and before he can even begin a line of questioning, Lin looks at him like with a double take, like there's a moment of recognition, and she says to the chief physician, "Uncle?" And the chief physician is like, "Why are you calling me uncle?" And then Lin would go on to explain why she had just called him uncle, and the chief physician was so shocked by her story that he left the room and he called for his wife. And then when his wife came to the hospital, he didn't tell her what was going on. He just said, "Come with me." She walks into the room with the chief physician, he and his wife, and Lin, who's never met this woman, and the woman has never met Lin, they see each other for the first time, and Lin looks at her and just goes, "Auntie." And it was at this point that Lin revealed to the chief physician and his wife that Lin really was not her name. That's what people called her, but that wasn't who she was. Her real name was Zhu Shuhua, and the chief physician and his wife literally couldn't believe it because they had not given any information about their personal lives to Lin. They've only listened to her story, and she's just offered up what she claims her name is. She's called them uncle and auntie, and wouldn't you know it, the chief physician and his wife, they did have a niece whose name was Zhu Shuhua, and a year earlier, she, their niece, had gone missing. She'd gone missing during the Chinese Civil War, and she had been presumed dead, but nobody had ever found her body. According to Lin, Zhu did die during that war. She was robbed and murdered by a group of fishermen. And then after she was killed, her spirit was sort of stuck in this purgatory for some time. But then, a year after Zhu's death, when Lin died, Lin said that Zhu's spirit entered Lin's body, And thus, she came back to life, Zhu did, but in a different body. And so Lin basically was telling the chief physician and his wife that she was Zhu. She had been reincarnated in Lin's body. And as crazy as this story sounded, the chief physician and his wife couldn't help but notice that as Lin was speaking, her accent was exactly like Zhu's. In fact, just generally speaking, Lin was acting exactly like their niece. She really did seem like the reincarnated version of Zhu. And then when they dug deeper and spoke more to Lin and also her husband Wu, the physician and his wife learned that, Lin, when she woke up and was reincarnated, suddenly she was a vegetarian, just like Zhu. Suddenly, Lin was interested in accounting and bookkeeping. Well, that was something that Zhu was interested in. And also, the biggest one was that Lin had been illiterate, but then she wakes up and suddenly she reads and speaks Mandarin fluently, the language that Zhu read and spoke. And so the chief physician, he couldn't help but start to believe that maybe Lin was telling the truth here. Maybe this really was his niece's reincarnated spirit. And so, as sort of strange as it was, he told the Taiwanese government that, there's something weird happening here, and, I can't help but believe that maybe there's some truth to this story. But if we really want to pressure test it, Lin claims that she knows who killed my niece. Like, she knows who killed her, because now she's Zhu. She said it was this particular group of fishermen. And actually, Lin had given the names of these fishermen that apparently robbed and killed Zhu. And so the chief physician told the government, why don't we investigate my niece's disappearance as a murder and go talk to those fishermen and see if that holds up. And so that's what the government did. They tracked these fishermen down, but unfortunately, only one of them was still alive. But they interviewed this guy, and Lin would actually say that particular fisherman, he was not one of the aggressors. He was actually the only fisherman in the group who tried to save Zhu, even though obviously she did get killed, but that fisherman had tried to stop what was happening to her. And when the government talked to him, he would say that yes, unfortunately, she was killed, and I did try to stop it, but I just couldn't. Keep in mind, this fisherman had not been given any information. This is entirely like a brand new investigation. He has no idea what they know. But he basically exactly mirrored what Lin said happened. And so based on this, they actually closed Zhu Shua's case. It was labeled a disappearance. They changed it to a murder, and they labeled her killers as the fishermen who were deceased at the time. But they were labeled as her killers, and they closed the case based entirely on, a reincarnated spirit's testimony. And there's one more thing. Back in the beginning of the story, when Wu is hustling home, biking as fast as he can to get to his sick wife, and he has those weird encounters with his neighbors, well, it would turn out when those neighbors were interviewed, they would say that the reason they gave those looks to Wu, those looks of disgust and disdain, is because, one, they knew Wu was married to Lin, and they were also aware that she was sick in bed. But here comes Wu pedaling up the road, and he's got this woman sitting on the back of his bike that is clearly not his wife. And so everyone's reaction to that is, Wu is having an affair on his poor wife who's sick in bed. What a horrible person. Now, Wu swore there was no woman on his bike, but he would recall that the bike did feel really heavy, like he was pulling extra weight at the end there. Later, Lin would say that actually Zhu's spirit had come down and hopped on the back of Wu's bike, and it was her basically riding along, hitching a ride up to their house. She was the woman that the neighbors were seeing. But Wu, he was so focused on getting home, even though he felt that heavy weight, he never turned around, and so he didn't see her. And then once Lin passed away, Zhu's spirit, who was now at the home, sort of waiting for this to happen, she switched places with her. For the rest of her life, Lin would live as Zhu, and she would become a community and spiritual leader. And she would pass away in 2018 at the age of 97, and at her funeral, there would be banners hung that actually said both names, Lin and Zhu. And so if reincarnation is real, this story might just be one of the most credible cases ever recorded. Just after midnight on June 22nd, 1991, Charles Holden was on his way home from work when he decided to stop at a fast food restaurant near his house in Harrington, Delaware. After grabbing a quick bite to eat, Charles left the store and got back in his truck. He turned it on and he was about to drive out of the lot when he stopped because there was this man running towards him, waving, trying to flag him down. So Charles put his truck back in park and he rolled his window down to see what this guy wanted. And when this stranger got close enough, he told Charles that his sister was having a baby and he needed a ride to the hospital hospital, which was about 20 minutes away. Charles couldn't tell if this guy was lying. It was super late. He didn't know this guy, and he just had a bad feeling about him. And so he told him, "No, I'm sorry. It's too late. I gotta get home. It's too far out of the way." The stranger immediately looked dejected and turned around and started walking away. And as Charles was watching him go, he felt bad and said, "You know what? Hey, come back here. I'll give you a ride part of the way there." And so the stranger smiled, hopped in his passenger seat, and they took off. Charles drove him approximately 3 miles in the direction he had asked to go before pulling over on the side of the road and telling him, "This is as far as I'm going to take you." Charles lived only about a block away, and he didn't want to drive too far away from home so late at night. But the stranger, upon hearing he was being let out so soon, suddenly became angry and began fumbling in his pocket like he was going to get a knife or some sort of weapon, and he starts screaming at Charles, "Hand over your keys, hand over your wallet, or I'm going to kill you." Charles, meanwhile, was on edge, just being in the car with this guy because he had a bad feeling about him, and so he immediately jumped into action. He turned off his truck, he ripped the keys out of the ignition, and he leapt out of his truck and started running. Charles saw way off in the distance was a convenience store, and he figured he could run to there and get some help. But as he's running, he turns around and sees the stranger has also leapt out of the car and was now sprinting up to him with a screwdriver in his hand. And this stranger was running really fast. He was gaining on Charles, and soon Charles realized he wasn't going to make it to the convenience store before this guy caught up to him. And so at some point, Charles just stops, he turns around and he puts his hands up and he says, okay, I'll give you a ride wherever you want to go, and then you can have my keys, my wallet, you can have anything you want. And so the stranger runs right up to Charles and he stops and he smiles because he's very pleased with this result. And he pokes him with the screwdriver and kind of gestures for him to go back to the truck. So Charles walks back to the truck with the stranger right behind him with the screwdriver periodically poking him in the back. They finally get to the vehicle and the stranger tells Charles to get in the car and then wait. But as soon as Charles sat down, he fired up his truck and sped off before the stranger could hop in the passenger side door. And so Charles is flying away from this guy. He looks in his rear view mirror and he can see the guy is chasing after him with a screwdriver held over his head, but he sees the stranger at some point just stops, turns around, and walks away. Charles was totally relieved that he had escaped this horrible encounter, and he was thinking about calling the police, but ultimately decided he wouldn't because it was his decision to allow some stranger to get in his car in the middle of the night. And so Charles kind of blamed himself for the whole ordeal. What Charles was concerned about, though, was where he had ditched the stranger was not far from his house, and he was worried if he just turned around and drove right back to his house that this guy could recognize the truck and then follow him to his house, and then who knows what could happen. And so Charles decides he's just going to stay outside of town and drive around for a while to make sure this stranger is long gone by the time he comes back. So after about an hour of doing just that, driving around outside of town, Charles goes back into Harrington, Delaware, and he gets on his street, and he's shocked when he sees the stranger who had just tried to kill him is walking down the road right in front of him. But luckily, the stranger did not hear or see Charles pull onto his street, and so Charles immediately throws it in reverse and he gets out of there and he drives off. At this point, Charles decides he needs to tell police because he doesn't know if this stranger actually knows him and that maybe he's targeting him and he's waiting for him at his property. And so he calls 911 and he tells the dispatcher about what had happened earlier and how this guy is now lurking around his property. And the dispatcher tells him they'll send an officer out to him. And so a few minutes later, an officer showed up at the payphone where Charles was, and they told Charles they would escort him back to his property, and if this stranger was still out in the area, they would arrest him. And so the two of them made their way back to Charles's property. They get there, the stranger's long gone, and then Charles goes into his house. There's no sign of a break-in. There's no sign that anyone was near his property. And so Charles thanks the officer. He feels totally relieved. But before the officer leaves, he asks him if he wouldn't mind doing a quick sweep of his mother's property. She lived right behind Charles on the other side of some bushes. He told the officer her name was Dorothy. She was 70 years old and she lived alone, and he just wanted to make sure nothing happened to her. So the officer said, no problem, I'll go check in on her. So the officer leaves Charles and goes across his backyard through those bushes into Dorothy's backyard. And right away, he can see the back window on the back door has been smashed and the door itself is slightly ajar. And so the officer draws their pistol and they go up and they enter the house and they look inside. They're yelling for Dorothy, but there's no answer. It's totally dark in the house. It's totally silent. And so after searching the first floor and finding nothing, they make their way up the flight of stairs and they find blood blood at the top of the landing. And they follow this trail of blood, and it brings them into one of the bedrooms where a woman is sprawled out on a bed. It was Dorothy. She had been stabbed to death. It would turn out, after Charles had ditched the stranger and sped off without him, the stranger, whose name was Gilbert Cannon, began looking for a place to sleep. And the house he ultimately selected just happened to be Charles's mother's house. After Gilbert broke in through her back door, he saw Dorothy coming down the steps to confront him, and because he was worried she'd be able to identify him, he attacked her with a screwdriver. Gilbert would later tell police that the attack on Charles was completely random. He was just at this fast food restaurant, he saw Charles get into his truck, and he thought to himself, if I can get in that guy's truck, I bet I can rob him. And then after this failed robbery, when Gilbert is out looking for a place to sleep and he breaks into this house and this woman comes down the stairs that he attacks and kills, he has no idea that this woman, Dorothy, is Charles's mother. The entire night was one big horrible coincidence. Gilbert would plead guilty to the murder and would be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In October of 2005, a 21-year-old named Nathan was back home in Elk Grove, California, visiting his mother at her apartment for a couple of days. Her apartment was part of this really safe complex. It was gated, there's lots of lights and cameras, so anything that went bump in the night was just going to be, your noisy neighbors or something. On the last night of Nathan's stay, he was laying in his bed in the guest room, listening to the hum of the street lamp that was outside, and the crickets and the passing by of cars, when he drifted off to sleep. At about 2 a.m., Nathan woke up, or so he thought. He couldn't move his body, he could only move his eyes, and even though he had never experienced sleep paralysis before, he instinctively understood this is probably that. He noticed the room was completely silent. There was no more crickets, no more hum of the light outside, no more traffic, just total silence. And then he started flashing his eyes around the room because he couldn't move his head or his body, and he started taking stock of the room. The bed he was in was positioned as far away from the door as he could in the back right corner. From where he was laying, if he looked to his right, in that corner was this big armoire, and then moving left from the armoire as he scanned the room, you'd come to the door, which is on the opposite side of where his bed was, and then if he kept scanning left, he would reach the foot of his bed, and just beyond the foot of his bed was a table and a chair. But because he was laying flat, he couldn't really look down and actually see the table and chair. And so with all of his strength, he managed to raise his head just enough that he had a line of sight to that section of his room, the only section he has not looked at yet. And he sees the table and chair, and he sees in the corner is this dark figure that's standing there looking at him. He's completely frozen with fear. His thought is, there's an intruder in the house. How did they get in here? What are they doing in here? And he managed to keep his head up just long enough to get a decent look at this dark figure, and he determined it was most likely a woman with a shawl covering her face. And before his head fell back to the pillow, he saw her suddenly crouch down on the ground out of view. And then Nathan's head fell back, and now he knows there's just some stranger in his room, and he can't lift his head up anymore, and he's looking around with his eyes. He sees the armoire, he sees the door, he can't see that table and chair, and then he hears the sound of someone slithering along the ground out of view, and he can hear her breathing as she's getting closer and closer to the edge of the bed. And he's laying there terrified. He's so scared he can't even make a sound, and he's telling himself this has to be a dream. Wake up, wake up, wake up. And he's laying there, and this woman, she stands up and she leans out over his bed, and she looks at him, and her face is pale and her eyes are sunk way back in her head. And then she begins to slowly crawl on top of him, and Nathan's sitting here looking at this woman. He wants to close his eyes, but he can't. And he just feels his chest being pressed down. He can hear the sounds of the springs compressing all around him as this woman positions herself on his chest. And then he finally manages to let out a scream, and then suddenly he's awake. The woman's gone. And he sits up and he's looking around. There's nobody in his room. The familiar hum of the light and the crickets and the traffic outside, they all return. And his mom comes running in the room, and she's like, "Hey, are you okay? I heard screaming in here." And he said, "Oh, no, I had a bad dream. I'm fine now. I had a terrible dream, but I'm fine now." And his mom's like, "Okay, all right, you need anything?" And he's like, "Nope." So she comes over, she gives him a hug and a kiss, she goes back to bed, and he would go downstairs, flip on a Disney movie, actually Aladdin, and he would fall asleep with a Disney movie on and with lights on. And there was no more sleep paralysis that night. The next day, Nathan got up and he headed back to his house, and he couldn't shake the experience. He had never had sleep paralysis before, but it was just so much more terrifying than he ever would have imagined. And he's just thinking to himself, I can't believe there are people that put up with this on any sort of regular basis. But, after a couple of days and getting home and not experiencing any sleep paralysis, time went on and he just kind of forgot about it. A few months later, in March of 2006, Nathan is at this big family party in Chico, California, big outdoor barbecue, all of his family's there, and at some point his sister shows up. His sister was not supposed to be attending this party, so it was a great surprise. He hasn't seen her in a while, and he immediately pulls her aside to catch up with her. And so for the first hour of their conversation, they're just chatting about their lives and what they're up to. Towards the end of their conversation, Nathan suddenly felt compelled to share his sleep paralysis experience with his sister. And the reason he wanted to was because he knew that she knew that he was actually a skeptic. And so she would believe him. If he's telling her this is what happened, she would believe that that's what he saw. And so he starts by saying, I had the weirdest experience at Mom's apartment just a couple of months ago. I'm pretty sure it was sleep paralysis. And his sister immediately butts in and she goes, wait a minute. I had sleep paralysis for the first time in my life 2 weeks ago at Mom's apartment. It was horrible. I was in the guest room and then I saw this woman and she was like standing on me. I thought I was gonna die. It was horrible. That's exactly what happened to me. I was laying in the guest room and I couldn't move, and then I saw a woman in the corner and she stood on my chest. They proceeded to go over all the details of each of their stories, and they discovered that they had had almost the exact same experience. And at the end of it, they wanted to have a rational explanation for how they both could just somehow have their only sleep paralysis experience in the same room in roughly the same timeline and experience the exact same events. They were trying to, come up with a rational explanation for that, but it was just too much of a coincidence. But ultimately, neither of them were really prepared to start discussing what else it could be. So they decided to just kind of laugh it off and say, man, that's pretty weird, and they moved on. After the party was over, Nathan would go back to his house and he would tell his wife about this crazy coincidence he and his sister had, and his wife would say, yeah, that's wild. But after that, Nathan just did not want to think about it or talk about it, and so he kind of just, pushed it out of his mental space and did forget about it. He moved on. 5 months later, in August of 2006, Nathan's mom would move out of that apartment building and she would move into a 2-story house still in Elk Grove, California. Shortly after she moved in, she asked Nathan if he would come spend a couple nights with her, and Nathan said sure. In order to better understand what happens to Nathan over the course of his stay at his mother's new house, you need to understand a basic layout of her house. So when you walk through her double doors, to your left is going to be a formal living room. In the center of the house is a hallway that shoots straight back to the kitchen. And then to your right when you walk in, there's a wall, and on that wall is the stairs leading up to the second floor. If you take those stairs to the second floor, you reach a landing where there's a window that looks back into the backyard, and immediately to your right, there is a single door, and that's the master bedroom where Nathan's mom would sleep. From the landing, if you turned left, there'd be another door that's a mirror image of the master bedroom door, and this door is the guest room. That's where Nathan was going to stay. And then to the left of the guest room was a hall that went to the front of the house, but that's irrelevant to the story. If you went inside the guest room, the bed was located in the back right corner, so the same layout as the guest room in the apartment building, where the person laying in the bed, so Nathan, his feet would be closest to the door. And from Nathan's perspective in the bed, the only other piece of furniture in this new house guest room was a table that was, from his perspective, on the right-hand wall, centered on the wall, and on the table was a TV. So that's the only things in the room. The first night Nathan was at this new house was totally uneventful. The second night, not so much. He was up in the guest room, laying on the bed, watching TV. The lights are off, it's just the TV on, and at some point, he dozes off. He wakes up a short time later, and he can't move. It's the same sensation he had when he was staying with his mom at her apartment. And he begins to panic because the last time he felt this way, a strange, veiled woman stood on his chest and made it feel like he was dying. And so immediately, he's trying to move his body, he can't, and so using his eyes, he starts looking around the room, praying this woman is not in the room with him. And so he looks to the right, to that corner, which he can see. There's no one there. From this corner, he starts scanning across the room. He sees the TV, it's still on. He keeps scanning and he sees the door and it's open. And then he scans and he's able to just barely make out the space at the foot of the bed. He can actually see to the corner, and this woman, she's not in here. And so initially, he feels incredibly relieved that she's not in the room with him. But then he finds himself focusing on the open door into the dark hallway. And he's thinking to himself, please please do not come walking through that door. And so he stares at the open door, just hoping he breaks out of the sleep paralysis, when he notices something about the TV. It's flickering. And so he averts his gaze to the TV, and he realizes what he's looking at on TV does not look familiar. It does not look like a TV show. It looks like CCTV camera footage, like it looks like a security camera footage. And he realizes the footage he's looking at is the inside of his mother's kitchen downstairs. He recognized the way it was laid out. That's his mother's house. That's downstairs. And he's staring at the footage thinking, why is this footage playing on the TV? And I don't think there's a camera down there. When he notices on the camera, the woman with the veil walks into the middle of the frame, and she looks up at the camera right as the camera turns off. And then the room is completely dark. There's no more ambient light in the room. The hallway is dark, and he's left paralyzed knowing this woman is downstairs in the kitchen. And as he's laying there, he hears her start running through the house. And it sounds like an animal is barreling into things as she's running through the bottom floor, and she stops at the foot of the stairs. And he's thinking to himself, I know where she's going. She's coming up to my room. And so as he's laying there, he feels his heart racing, and he's staring at the open door. He knows she's going to come flying up those stairs, and she's going to come through that door. And instead of running up the stairs, he hears her take one step, two-step. And as she's making her way up the stairs, he's just thinking, please break out of this trance, stop this paralysis, wake up, wake up. And then he sees her head emerge, and she turns to look at him from the stairs into the room. And once she sees it's him, she bolts around and starts charging into the room on all fours like an animal. At this point, Nathan lets out a primal scream. He is scared for his life as this woman is charging towards him, and she stops dead in her tracks right in the middle of the room. She looks at him, turns around, and crashes out of the room, charges downstairs, and then it's silent. As soon as she was downstairs, Nathan could sit up. Except it did not feel like the first time he had sleep paralysis at his mom's apartment, when he sat up and he had the sensation of relief. You've woken up. You were asleep before. Now you're awake. This time, it was like he was always awake, but now he can sit up. He did not have a sense of relief. In fact, he was worried she was still in the house. And as he's sitting up in bed, his mother comes running into the room. She looks disheveled. She's half asleep. And she's like, was that you? Were you running around the house? I could have sworn I heard someone running around the house. Was that you? Nathan's looking at her, and he can't even process what he's been through, whether that was real, whether it was a dream. And he's trying to find the words to describe to his mom the dream he had, but like he can't process what's happening. And he just says, Mom, we have to check the house. We have to make sure no one's in the house. And so the two of them flip on every light upstairs. They're not even talking. At this point, it's survival mode. They turn on all the lights upstairs, and Nathan leads the way down. They're flicking on all the lights, and they manage to search the whole house, and there's no sign of a break-in. There's no one in their house. After the coast was clear and they felt like they were not in immediate danger, they went into the kitchen to kind of talk about what just happened. And so Nathan's like, okay, Mom, I just got to tell you everything that I'm thinking right now. I can't really process what just happened. I think it was a bad dream, but I'm starting to think that it could be something else, or I'm just losing my mind. So a few months ago, I was sleeping in your guest room in your apartment, and I had an experience that I'm almost positive was sleep paralysis. You know, I was laying there, I couldn't move, and this figure was in the room, and they were standing on me. It was terrifying, but it sounded an awful lot like sleep paralysis. But then a couple months after that, I talked to my sister, and I told her about it. And she told me that very recently, right before you moved into this house, actually, she was in that room, and she also had basically the exact same experience. She had never had sleep paralysis before. I had never had sleep paralysis before. So we've basically had the exact same horrifying experience in the same room around the same time. And then just now, tonight, I had another sleep paralysis experience with the same woman who was running around the house, and you just said you heard her running around the house. His mom looked really concerned, but she wasn't shocked. She says to Nathan, I have seen this woman. I saw her in my apartment way long time ago, but I remember what you're describing. That's the experience I had. This woman, showed up in the room, and she stood on me, and it scared the heck out of me, but I didn't tell anyone because I thought it was sleep paralysis. And so Nathan and his mom proceeded to spend the next several hours just talking through what this could be. How could they, all three of them, him, his mom, and his sister, how could all of them have had the exact same experience? And how could tonight, when Nathan had this experience, how could his mom have heard those footsteps if that was indeed sleep paralysis. Because it wasn't Nathan, he was in the bedroom. And it wasn't his mom, she was in her bedroom. And she didn't have any pets, so who could it be? Nathan says he and his family are still totally rattled by this experience, and they don't have an answer. And this is a family of skeptics, so they're not looking for a reason to call this paranormal. They simply don't have the answers. Nathan has said that he, his mom, and his sister have not had any further experiences with the woman in black ever since that last experience Nathan had, and they're just hoping it stays.